Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Absolutely.
Today, we're diving into the leadership, influence, and legacy of Vladimir Putin.
Right.
And to do that, we're going to be looking at an excerpt from a source called Vladimir Putin Leadership, Influence, and Legacy.pdf.
Yeah, I think this is a good one to give us some background and context for, Putin's journey and his impact on Russia, but also his place on the world stage.
Right, yeah, and this deep dive is really going to give us, hopefully, a nuanced understanding of Putin. So where do we even begin? I mean, he's been around for so long.
Yeah, well, to grasp the complexities of Putin's trajectory, I think we have to start with the context.
Right.
The decline of the Soviet Union and the Boris Yeltsin era,
Right.
those were really formative experiences that shaped his worldview.
Right, and his early career, of course, he was a KGB officer for quite a while.
Right, from 1975 to 1991.
Right, so that undoubtedly played a significant role in his perspective.
Definitely. The KGB instilled in him, discipline, loyalty to the state, and I think a very particular understanding of power and control, which I think we see throughout his career, that would profoundly influence his actions.
Absolutely. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, he called it a geopolitical catastrophe.
Right.
So that sense of loss and that disruption was clearly a driving force in, I think, a lot of his ambition to restore Russia to a position of global strength, influence, and power.
Precisely. And I think that ambition is what guides all of his policies, domestic and foreign, right, from his early days all the way through his presidency.
Okay, well, let's trace that ascent. He leaves the KGB, then he goes and works with Anatoly Sobchak in St. Petersburg.
Yes, and that's a crucial period for Putin.
Right.
Because he gained valuable experience as deputy mayor, like navigating the complexities of government. He developed a reputation as a very effective administrator, like someone who can get things done. And I think that pragmatism, that competence really served him well in the years that followed.
Yeah, which would eventually lead him to Moscow, where he joined the Yeltsin administration.
Yeah, late 1990s.
Yeah.
And again, his ability to navigate that turbulent political landscape, plus his loyalty, his discretion, all of that marked him as a rising star.
Right. And in 1998, he becomes head of the FSB.
Yeah, which, for those who don't know, is the successor to the KGB. And that gave him immense control over Russia's security apparatus.
Right.
And really cemented his position in the existing power structure.
And then Yeltsin's surprise resignation in 1999.
December of 99.
Right.
Propels Putin into the role of acting president.
Acting president. And then, of course, Yeltsin is granted immunity from prosecution.
Right, which is really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because it points to this intricate power dynamic at play. I mean, it suggests a very carefully negotiated transition, with Putin emerging as the chosen successor, entrusted with protecting, I think, the interests of the outgoing leader and his circle.
Right, right. And the timing of the Second Chechen War, which began in August of 99, was also very significant.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the conflict allowed Putin to project this image of strength and decisiveness, qualities that resonated with a Russian public that was weary of the chaos of the Yeltsin years.
Right.
His tough stance against the Chechen separatists, coupled with this very effective media campaign that really portrayed him as a resolute leader, solidified his public support, and ultimately, paved the way for his formal election as president in March of 2000.
And once he's in office, Putin consolidates power. I mean, he starts building an authoritarian state. He goes after the oligarchs, these people who had amassed so much wealth and influence.
Yeah, it was a systematic targeting, really. I mean, you think about figures like Boris Berezovsky,
Right.
Vladimir Kaczynski. These were powerful figures in the media and finance sectors, and suddenly they find themselves facing legal challenges, forced into exile, stripped of their assets. And the message was clear. Loyalty to the state and to Putin personally was paramount.
Right. The era of the untouchable oligarch was over.
Exactly.
But it's important to note, he wasn't eliminating the oligarchy entirely, right?
No, not at all. He was reshaping it,
Right.
ensuring that those who remained understood that their wealth and influence were contingent upon their allegiance to the regime.
Right. So he created a system of crony capitalism.
Yes, exactly. Economic power intertwined with political loyalty. Those who played by Putin's rules, they were rewarded, while those who challenged him, they were dealt with swiftly and ruthlessly. And, this strategy not only consolidated his power, it also provided a crucial source of financial support for his regime.
Right. And this crackdown on the oligarchs goes hand in hand with how he restructures regional governance, right?
Yeah.
Centralizing power back in the Kremlin.
Yes. He established 7 federal districts, each overseen by a presidential envoy. So, in effect, he brought regional leaders under much tighter control, and it eroded the autonomy of the regions and concentrated decision-making power in Moscow,
Yeah.
further strengthening Putin's grip on the government.
Right. And the media, of course, the media landscape undergoes a dramatic transformation under Putin.
It does. And I think he recognized early on that control over information was absolutely essential for maintaining power and silencing those dissenting voices.
Right. You have independent television channels like NTV, known for their critical reporting.
Right.
And they're either absorbed by state-affiliated entities or effectively silenced through a combination of legal pressure, financial manipulation, and outright intimidation.
Right.
It creates a media landscape dominated by pro-Kremlin voices.
Right. Limits access to alternative viewpoints and really shapes public perception in favor of the regime.
And this control over information, I think, it goes hand in hand with this very carefully crafted narrative of stability and national pride.
Right, and that's a key part of it. They position themselves as the force that rescued Russia from the chaos and economic turmoil of the Yeltsin years, a narrative that resonated with the public yearning for a return to order, a sense of national purpose, and the economic recovery of the early 2000s, fueled by rising oil prices, that further bolstered this narrative. I mean, the rising standard of living for many Russians, it provided tangible evidence, right, of his competence and his effectiveness.
Right.
Creating this sense that the country was finally on the right track.
Right. So now that he's consolidated his power domestically, he turns his attention
to the world stage.
Right, to reasserting Russia's influence.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think his foreign policy from the early 2000s onward was driven by this very clear objective to challenge the perceived dominance of the West, particularly the United States, and reestablish Russia as a major player, a force to be reckoned with. And it led him to pursue this more assertive, often confrontational approach, marked by strategic alliances, military interventions, and a willingness to use force to protect what he perceived as Russia's vital interests.
And he viewed the expansion of NATO and the European Union as a direct threat
Oh, absolutely.
to Russian security.
Yeah, he believed that the West was encroaching on Russia's traditional sphere of influence and seeking to weaken its position.
Right. This perception of encirclement and threat
Right.
became a recurring theme.
Yes, absolutely.
I think in a lot of his rhetoric.
Absolutely. It informs his foreign policy decisions. So he responds to what he sees as Western aggression with a multi-pronged approach, right? You see him forging strategic alliances with countries like China, Iran, engaging in military interventions in Georgia and Ukraine. And he adopts this increasingly assertive posture in international forums.
And the 2008 Russo-Georgian War was a pretty clear signal of Russia's willingness to use military force.
Right, to protect what it saw as its sphere of influence. I mean, that conflict, it only lasted 5 days.
Right.
But it resulted in significant casualties and displacement.
Right.
And it really demonstrated that Russia was prepared to use hard power to achieve its geopolitical goals and challenge the Western-led order.
While being condemned by Western powers, the victory played well domestically.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the swift, decisive victory reinforces this image of Putin as a strong leader, a leader willing to defend Russian interests,
Right.
even at the risk of international condemnation. So this, of course, bolsters his popularity and strengthens his grip on power at home.
And then 2014, the annexation of Crimea
Really sent shockwaves.
through the international community.
Right. I mean, it was a significant escalation in tensions
Ooh, it was.
between Russia and the West.
And the annexation, which followed this very swiftly executed military operation and hastily organized referendum, was condemned as a violation of international law
Right.
and Ukrainian sovereignty.
Right.
However, it was met with widespread support within Russia, where it was seen as a restoration of historical justice, reclaiming territory that had been part of Russia for centuries.
Yeah. I mean, I think this move also reveals a key aspect of Putin's worldview.
Oh, yeah.
This belief in Russia's historical right to dominate what's called its near abroad,
Right.
and that he's willing to use force to achieve these goals.
Absolutely. And I think the annexation of Crimea is a real watershed moment. It marks a turning point in Russia's relations with the West and, arguably sets the stage for the even more dramatic events of 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine.
Right. But before we get to that, there's the intervention in Syria.
Ah, yes, 2015.
I mean, that really showcases Russia's willingness to project power beyond its borders, to insert itself into complex geopolitical conflicts. And the intervention, which involved airstrikes, military advisors, support for the Syrian government, you know, it helps to turn the tide of the civil war in favor of President Bashar al-Assad and really establishes Russia as this key player in the Middle East.
This assertive foreign policy, though, it does come at a cost.
It does. I mean, the annexation of Crimea, the intervention in Syria, these lead to international sanctions, they damage Russia's reputation, and of course they fuel tensions with the West. And I think it all sets the stage for what will become the defining moment in Putin's career, a pivotal event in 21st century history, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Right. And this act of aggression, which Putin labeled a special military operation, was just a dramatic escalation of that conflict that had been simmering in eastern Ukraine since 2014. And it marks, I think, a turning point in Russia's relations with the West and in the global order.
The invasion of Ukraine in 2022, is a culmination of years of simmering tensions fueled by Putin's perception of NATO expansion as, an existential threat to Russia and his belief in Ukraine's historical and cultural ties to Russia.
Yeah. In his address announcing the invasion, he laid out his justification,
Right.
which included the need to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, claiming that the Ukrainian government was committing genocide against Russian-speaking populations in the Donbass region,
Right.
and asserting that NATO's expansion posed an unacceptable threat to Russia's security.
Of course, those justifications were widely challenged and refuted by the international community.
Right.
I mean, independent investigations found no evidence to support the claims of genocide, and NATO has consistently maintained that its posture is defensive in nature.
And the invasion triggered this swift and decisive response from the West.
Oh, absolutely.
Unprecedented economic sanctions targeting Russia's financial system, key industries, and individuals close to Putin.
And these sanctions were designed to cripple the Russian economy, to pressure Putin to change course. And they included some pretty serious measures like restrictions on Russian banks' access to the SCREET international payment system, asset freezes on Russian oligarchs and government officials, and bans on imports of Russian oil and gas.
And these measures have had a significant impact, right? I mean, sharp decline in the value of the ruble, soaring inflation, and a contraction in economic output.
Absolutely. And, beyond Russia, the sanctions have disrupted global supply chains, which has contributed to rising energy prices and food shortages, particularly in countries that are heavily reliant on Russian and Ukrainian exports.
And while the sanctions have inflicted this economic pain on Russia,
Yeah.
their effectiveness in altering Putin's strategic calculus, it remains a subject of debate.
Right, yeah, for sure. I mean, Putin has shown a willingness to absorb significant economic costs in pursuit of his geopolitical objectives. He's also sought to mitigate the impact of sanctions, by pivoting towards alternative markets, particularly in Asia, and by strengthening ties with countries like China, who haven't joined the Western sanctions regime.
Right. And beyond the economic fallout, the invasion has also triggered a profound humanitarian crisis.
Yes. Millions of Ukrainians displaced from their homes, fleeing to neighboring countries, or seeking refuge within Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in significant loss of life, both military and civilian, and it's caused widespread destruction of infrastructure, disruption of essential services. And of course, the war has exacerbated existing global challenges like food insecurity and energy shortages, and it's raised fears of a wider conflict, one that could potentially draw in NATO and other major powers.
And domestically, within Russia,
Yeah.
the invasion has led to a tightening of political control,
Right.
increased repression of dissent, a further crackdown on independent media and civil society.
Yeah, Putin has sought to stifle any opposition to the war, framing it as this patriotic struggle against Western aggression, and, using propaganda and censorship to control the narrative and suppress any dissenting voices.
All right. So let's shift gears now and delve a little deeper into how Putin has maintained his grip on power for so long, despite the challenges and controversies that have marked his rule.
Sure. I mean, one key factor has been his mastery of media control and propaganda.
Right, as we've discussed.
Exactly. He moved early in his tenure to bring those major television networks under state control, ensuring that the vast majority of Russians received this carefully curated version of events that bolstered his image and marginalized opposition voices.
And this control over the narrative has been crucial in shaping public perception
Absolutely.
and fostering a sense of national unity around his leadership. It's allowed him to portray himself as a strong and decisive leader, protecting Russia from those external enemies, but also internal threats.
Right, while demonizing his opponents as weak or corrupt or unpatriotic.
Right. The annexation of Crimea in 2014.
Yeah, what a masterstroke.
Right. I mean, that swift and bloodless operation.
Right.
Followed by this carefully orchestrated media campaign.
It was presented as a triumph for Putin, a restoration of historical justice.
Right.
A demonstration of Russia's resurgent power.
And it tapped into this vein of national pride and historical grievance,
Yeah.
really rallying the public behind Putin, bolstering his popularity, even as it drew condemnation from the international community.
Exactly. And this control over the information space has allowed Putin to deflect blame for economic setbacks, to downplay the costs of his foreign policy adventures, and to really suppress any genuine public debate about the direction of the country.
And beyond traditional media, Putin has also extended his control over the internet.
Right.
Recognizing its influence as a platform for those alternative viewpoints and the mobilization of dissent.
Absolutely. And his regime has implemented a series of measures to restrict online freedoms, including laws that allow for the blocking of websites deemed to be spreading extremist content or engaging in other activities deemed harmful to the state.
Right.
And of course, this has been used to target opposition websites, independent media outlets, and platforms that host those critical voices.
And it creates a chilling effect.
It does.
On online dissent, right?
Yes.
Making it more difficult for these opposition groups to organize to reach a wider audience with their message.
And in addition to that censorship, the Russian government has also invested heavily in its own propaganda efforts online.
Right.
Creating this vast network of websites, social media accounts, and troll farms that spread disinformation and promote pro-Kremlin narratives.
Right. Designed to sow discord.
Yes.
To undermine trust in democratic institutions.
Right.
And to shape public opinion in favor of the regime.
Absolutely. And, they've been particularly effective in amplifying pro-Kremlin narratives about the war in Ukraine, portraying it as this defensive measure against NATO aggression and as a necessary step to protect Russian speakers from persecution.
So you have the sophisticated propaganda machine.
Yeah.
Coupled with the suppression of genuine dissent.
It creates an information environment where it is difficult for ordinary Russians to access unbiased information, to form their own opinions about events.
Right. And this has been crucial in maintaining public support for his rule, even as his policies have become increasingly repressive and his foreign adventures more costly and dangerous.
Right. And another key factor in Putin's enduring grip on power has been his success in cultivating this image of strength and competence.
From those early days as a former KGB agent to his very carefully staged public appearances, showcasing his physical prowess.
Riding horses shirtless.
Right. I mean, it's this image of masculinity and decisiveness that resonates with many Russians.
And it's further bolstered by his assertive foreign policy, which has been portrayed domestically as a restoration of Russia's rightful place on the world stage after the perceived humiliations of the 1990s.
Right. So he's skillfully exploited this image to his advantage, presenting himself as the only leader capable of protecting Russia from its enemies, both external and internal.
And it allows him to justify a wide range of repressive measures, from the crackdown on independent media and civil society to the persecution of political opponents and the launching of costly and risky military interventions.
So his ability to control the narrative,
Yeah.
to suppress dissents,
Right.
to project this image of strength and competence have been absolutely crucial in maintaining his grip on power for over 2 decades.
They have. However, his rule has also been marked by these deep contradictions, with successes often overshadowed by failures and promises of stability and prosperity undermined by repression, corruption, and economic stagnation.
Yeah. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has really exposed the fragility, I think, of his model of governance, revealing the limits of his power and the costs of his authoritarianism.
Absolutely. I mean, the war has triggered this wave of international condemnation, unprecedented economic sanctions, and a growing sense of isolation for Russia on the world stage. And, it's sparked a renewed debate about the future of Russia in a post-Putin era and the challenges of transitioning from a system built on personality cult and repression to one based on democratic principles and the rule of law. It's interesting how Putin's economic policies, they've been just as impactful as his political maneuvers.
Absolutely. I mean, they're intertwined, right?
They are. And his economic approach, it's evolved over his time in power, shaped by, internal challenges and external pressures.
Yeah. The early years, 2000, 2008,
Right.
they're marked by this period of relative economic stability and growth.
Right, often referred to as the fat years. I mean, we have rising global oil prices, which of course fuel Russia's energy-dependent economy, and a series of market-oriented reforms that helped stabilize the economy after, the turmoil of the 1990s.
And his government implements a flat income tax rate,
Hmm.
simplifies the tax code, streamlines business regulations, to create a more predictable environment for investment and entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and these reforms, coupled with that favorable external environment, led to significant GDP growth, reduced inflation, and a rise in living standards for many Russians.
Like we were talking about before, there's this darker side to this prosperity, right?
Right, always.
I mean, the benefits of growth, they weren't evenly distributed.
Right, corruption became deeply entrenched.
Right. And the concentration of wealth among, this small group of oligarchs loyal to Putin.
Yeah, it creates this system of crony capitalism where political connections are essential for economic success.
Right. State corporations like Gazprom and Rosneft, operating in key sectors like energy and natural resources, used to assert control over strategic assets to reward loyalty.
Exactly. And, this system, while it generated significant wealth for the elite, it also stifled competition, it discouraged innovation, and it created a climate of impunity that allowed corruption to flourish.
And then the 2008 global financial crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, it exposed the vulnerabilities of this model.
It did. You see the sharp decline in oil prices, Russia goes into recession, and there's this realization that the country needs to diversify its economy and reduce its reliance on natural resources.
But even with those efforts, the underlying structure of crony capitalism remained largely intact.
Yeah. And then the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the subsequent Western sanctions, those marked a real turning point.
Right. I mean, those sanctions, they targeted key sectors of the Russian economy.
They did.
They restricted access to international finance and technology.
Yeah, it forced Putin to adopt this more defensive economic posture.
And he responds by promoting import substitution, seeking alternative markets, strengthening ties with, non-Western partners, particularly China.
Right, which mitigated some of the immediate impacts of sanctions, but it also came with those long-term costs.
Right, reinforcing Russia's isolation from the global economy, hindering technological development and limiting the country's growth potential.
Exact.
And then the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the intensification of Western sanctions, those just exacerbate these challenges even further.
Yeah, pushing the Russian economy towards greater autarky and dependence on a shrinking circle of allies.
Right, so the long-term economic outlook.
It remains uncertain.
Right.
But I think the current trajectory suggests a path of declining living standards, technological stagnation, and, increased dependence on China.
As we've been exploring Putin's legacy across all these different domains, one consistent thread really emerges.
What's that?
And that's the suppression of dissent, the erosion of civil society.
Yeah. I mean, from the early days of his rule, Putin recognized that maintaining power, it required more than just controlling those levers of government.
Right.
It meant shaping the hearts and minds of the people.
Right, the power of narrative.
Yeah.
Creating a compelling story
Absolutely.
that could unite the nation behind his leadership and legitimize his actions.
And this narrative, carefully crafted, relentlessly promoted through state-controlled media, it rested on several key pillars, right? This idea of restoring national pride, defending those traditional values, and portraying Russia as, this besieged fortress surrounded by enemies.
And the victory in World War II, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War,
Right.
became a central theme.
Yeah, a potent symbol of national unity and sacrifice, something that could be invoked to rally the population behind Putin's leadership. And of course, the Russian Orthodox Church, with its emphasis on those traditional values and its historical ties to the Russian state, became a key ally.
Right, a moral and spiritual underpinning.
Exactly. I mean, this alliance between the Kremlin and the church, it served both parties well. The church gained influence and resources, while Putin secured the support of a powerful institution that could help legitimize his policies and shape public opinion.
Right. But this narrative of national revival
Yeah.
and defense of traditional values was also used to justify the suppression of dissenting voices, the erosion of civil liberties.
Absolutely. Opposition political parties, they were marginalized. Independent media outlets were silenced. Non-governmental organizations, particularly those receiving funding from abroad, they were subjected to increasing pressure and scrutiny.
And the 2012 Foreign Agent Law.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a key tool in this crackdown.
He was.
Requiring NGOs that receive foreign funding to register as foreign agents,
Yeah.
effectively stigmatizing them and hindering their activities.
And that law, along with those other restrictive measures, created this hostile environment for independent civil society, making it increasingly difficult for organizations to operate freely and to challenge the government's narrative.
And this suppression of dissent, it extended beyond these formal institutions,
Right, yeah.
to encompass this broader chilling effect on free speech and public discourse.
Absolutely. Individuals who dared to criticize the government or, express views deemed unpatriotic, they faced harassment, intimidation, and even imprisonment.
Alexei Navalny.
Yeah, stark example.
Right. I mean, this prominent opposition leader, anti-corruption activist.
Right. He repeatedly exposed corruption, and he was subjected to repeated arrests, imprisonment, and even an attempt on his life.
Right, through poisoning.
And I think his experience, along with countless others, really highlights the extent to which Putin's regime has gone to silence those dissenting voices and to create a climate of fear and self-censorship.
And this systematic suppression, it's been crucial, again, in maintaining his grip on power.
It has.
But it's come at a high cost.
Oh, absolutely. It's stifled debate, undermined democratic institutions, and created this culture of fear and conformity that inhibits creativity, innovation, and progress.
So as we conclude this deep dive into Vladimir Putin,
Yeah.
we find Russia at a crossroads.
I think that's a great way to put it.
I mean, his rule has been marked by both undeniable achievements
Right.
and profound failures, right? By moments of national resurgence, but also periods of deep repression. He's restored stability, a sense of national pride after the turmoil of the 1990s.
Right.
But he's also presided over this increasingly authoritarian system that has stifled dissent and undermined democratic values.
Yeah, I mean, he reasserted Russia's role on the world stage,
Right.
but he's also isolated the country internationally and triggered this costly and dangerous war in Ukraine.
His legacy will be debated for generations to come, but one thing is certain. His impact on Russia and the world has been profound.
Yes.
And the question is, what happens next for Russia in a post-Putin era? Will the system he built prove resilient, or will it crumble under the weight of its own contradictions? Will a new generation of leaders emerge capable of charting a different course, one based on democratic principles, respect for human rights, and peaceful coexistence with its neighbors? I think these are the questions that are going to shape the future of Russia and its place in the world. And while only time will tell what the answers may be, I think understanding Putin and his legacy is absolutely essential for navigating the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.